Let Me Tell You a Story is a product of Carolina Storyteller, starring Jonathan Phoenix, written, produced, and directed by Jonathan Phoenix, edited and recorded by Jonathan Phoenix, and horribly marketed by Jonathan Phoenix. Man, I gotta hire a staff. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/Carolina Storyteller and subscribe to get exclusive content and all kinds of other neat stuff. We even have merchandise coming. Anyway, sit back and enjoy the show. How's it going, folks? Welcome back. I'm glad you guys are here with me for another story time. Hope you guys have had a great week. I've had a decent week. I want to hit you guys off with a experience story that happened to me. Have you guys ever had any paranormal experiences? Like, I started having paranormal experiences at a really young age. I started having bad experiences at a really young age too, but that's beside the point. But in my preteen years, I lived in Georgetown, South Carolina. If you know anything about the place, well, the entire town is basically haunted. The entire state of South Carolina is basically haunted. I don't think you can throw a rock without there being a ghost somewhere in the vicinity, or at least a ghost story about something in the vicinity. So, of course, I had my fair share of run-ins with the paranormal. And today's story is going to be about an event that I just never could. Still to this day, I can't explain. Like, I try to explain some of it, even though people tell me that, that explanation doesn't work. But there's still things about it that I will never be able to explain. Anyway, sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. So as a young foster child, my foster parents didn't just live in Georgetown. They lived in historic Georgetown on Prince Street. And I moved into the house on Prince Street, I think when I was about 11. And I began making friends in the neighborhood. And when I was 13, I became friends with the man who was still my best friend to this day. And he had like the coolest dad. I'm talking the coolest dad in the world. Every time I would be over there, his dad would play cards with us, or he'd tell us ghost stories, or, some kind of cool thing. And one night I was staying the night at his house, and it was me, my best friend, my best friend's brother, and my best friend's cousin. And of course, my best friend's dad. And we were telling ghost stories, and the idea came up that we should do what they called a graveyard walk. I'd never done a graveyard walk before, so I was really interested to find out what this was. It turns out a graveyard walk is where they go out at 12 midnight, walk down the street, because there's a graveyard just down the street, and walk through the graveyard telling the ghost stories. And because I didn't want to sound like a chicken, I of course agreed to go. It was around midnight when we all threw our shoes on and walked the short block down to where this graveyard that we were going to go walk through was. Now, it was behind a church and took up most of a city block and had been there since around the late 1600s, early 1700s. There were graves in there that are older than this country, much less older than me and you. So as we get there, we walk through the gates, past the church, and into the graveyard. And my best friend's dad starts telling us ghost stories about this graveyard. And he's running us around, and he's going to different places and telling us different ghost stories. And we maybe spent half an hour running around. And finally, he tells us the big ghost story of the graveyard as we get over to the other exit to the graveyard that exits onto the side street. And that story was that in the early 1900s, around 1920, 1925, sometime in there, A young woman was walking home from the theater on Front Street, which was just a few blocks away, and she walked past this very graveyard. Apparently, as she was walking past, she was snatched in by some unknown force. She was able to get out one scream for help, which was heard by neighbors nearby, and that was the last anyone heard from her. She was snatched in. The police were called. They responded. And when they arrived, what they found was half of her body on one side of the tombstone, and the other half of her body looking as if it had been torn off in the arms of the caretaker of the graveyard. Now, immediately they opened fire and shot the caretaker, assuming that he was the culprit. And legend has it that he was not, in fact, the culprit, that it was someone else. But he was still shot and killed, cradling the top half of this woman's lifeless corpse. And to this day, it's supposedly an unsolved crime in Georgetown, and it's the basis for many creepy legends. And of course, hearing it made this graveyard all the more creepy, which is probably why what happened next was just probably the dumbest thing that we could have done, but we did it anyway. Now, I don't remember whose bright idea it was that we walk the graveyard solo, but someone came up with a bright idea. There was a challenge that was issued, and the challenge was that we would walk from the front gate where we entered down past the mausoleum where the old caretaker was laid to rest, turn and then walk, of course, all the way down to the next side, turn again, walk back across the backside, and then come up the backside of the church and back around to the gate. There was no reward, it was just a challenge. A challenge issued to 4 teenage boys who felt that they had something to prove. But at first, nobody wanted to accept it. Nobody was willing to go. Everybody was kind of afraid. Well, my best friend's brother, he said he'd do it if the cousin went with him. And they were the first ones to take the walk. So we sat there and we watched them walk down and along the graves. They were obviously a little skittish, and they got to that mausoleum right by the first turn, and you could just see them. Something freaked them out, and they jumped the fence. Well, that left me and my best friend, and always being the leader, my best friend decided he was going to go first, and I decided I was going to let him. So he began his walk, and he got down to about the same place, and then he also jumped that fence. Now, this left me with a rare opportunity. I was kind of the runt of the group. Really felt like I had a lot to prove. I was a foster kid. I was the only one that technically wasn't in the family. And I always thought that they were a lot braver and tougher than me. So this was my chance to prove myself. Not just to me, but to them. To their dad, who I thought was awesomely cool. To their cousin, who I didn't know that well, but I wanted to think that I was cool. So I decided I was going to begin my walk, and nothing was going to stop me. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a graveyard in the middle of the night, but something feels off about it when you're there, even when you're with people. But being in one alone, that feeling is just 10 times worse. And as I started my walk, I felt like I was going somewhere that I really didn't belong. But I wasn't going to be stopped. So I kept making my way down. I heard behind me as my best friend's brother and cousin returned to where his dad was standing to watch. I'm assuming they expected that I was about to jump the fence. But I got to that corner. I looked at that mausoleum, And I walked right past it and made the turn, walking down to the next corner of the lot. Now that put me halfway through. I had made it further than anybody so far. I had passed the mausoleum where everybody had gotten scared. And I was making the turn for the third leg of my trip. I could see the others, at least I thought I could see them, up by the gate. So I thought, if I can see them, they can see me. If something did go wrong, God forbid, a zombie popped out or whatever it was that killed that poor woman in the 1920s showed up, they could get to me and they could rescue me and I would be okay. Everything would be fine. So I pressed on. I wasn't going to be stopped. I wasn't going to be called Scaredy Cat anymore. People were going to know I was brave. That's when I heard something. The noise came from behind me, from the area of the mausoleum. It was a shuffling sound, followed by a low moan. I turned and looked, and there was a large, maybe 6-7 foot figure, but all I could make out was just a shadow. I couldn't tell who it was. It was bulky, with thick arms, and it was shambling towards me. I wasn't scared. I assumed that it was one of them trying to play a joke on me. I assumed somebody was trying to stop me. After all I had to do was make it to the back of the church and then around the other side, and I had won. I was braver than all of them. So I turned my back to it and kept walking, determined not to be stopped. The noise kept coming from behind me. I kept hearing the shambling and the moaning. And I could look and I could see that not all of them were there by the gate. So I knew it had to be one of them. It had to be. So I just turned around, and from my gut, I just let out a roar at it, screaming with all my anger that it was daring to try and stop me, letting it know I wasn't scared at all and that if it continued, I'd fight it, which I assumed was, I don't know, my best friend's dad, my best friend's cousin. Couldn't have been my best friend or his brother because we were all around the same height, and this was obviously taller than all of us. But whatever it was, whoever it was, I was ready to fight it. I wasn't going to flee. I turned again and I continued walking. I made it around the back of the church without being further harassed. Walked back around the other side, and as I was coming, my best friend's dad came running up and grabbed me and he goes, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And I was like, "I'm fine. Why did you do that to me? That wasn't funny." And he said, "Well, that wasn't me." "Well, tell your son's cousin it wasn't funny. I didn't like that. Y'all were trying to punk me, trying to play me out, make me seem like I was scared. I didn't like that at all. That wasn't cool." But he denied it. He led me out of the graveyard, and there were all the other boys sitting across the street on the curb, looking at me just shocked. As we all got together outside of the graveyard, sitting across the street, I was the only one who didn't decide to sit on the curb. I was too angry. I believed 100% that they were lying to me and that one of them had to have been what I saw in the graveyard. They claimed that they were in different places. My best friend said that he was nearest to me by a tree when he saw it. His brother and cousin, they were planning on jumping out from graves down by the church, but when they saw it, they immediately ran. And of course, we're waiting outside on the street. And my friend's dad said that he tried to get to me because even he didn't know what it was. I was sure they were all lying to me. Had I thought more about it, I probably would have realized that they really didn't have a reason to lie to me. I mean, I'd have beaten them. I made it around even with them trying to scare me. But they just kept going on that it was real, and I didn't want to believe them. So finally, I challenged them back. I said, well, if there's something else in there, I'm going to go in and find it. And I started my way across the street back into the graveyard. I was determined. My best friend's dad was trying to stop me, but I wasn't listening. I kept walking, and as soon as my foot hit the sidewalk right outside of the gates to the graveyard, it happened. The scream just erupted from inside the cemetery. Everybody ran. It took me a moment to realize everybody was running, because they started running, all four of them. And then I caught up to them and ran past them and ran into the house and ran up the stairs. They caught up to me eventually, but it was at that moment that I realized that there was something definitely going on. I slept the rest of that night clutching a rosary, and I swear outside the window, directly over the bed where my head was laying, I could see this form with glowing red eyes, almost watching me. And I would see that form many times throughout my life, almost as if it was just interested, curious about what I was. But that night, for the first time, I was terrified of something in the dark.